It was the kind of midnight revelation that no one inside Clarence's house could have anticipated. A discovery so shocking that it shattered the fragile calm of the royal household. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the stories the palace hoped would stay hidden behind closed doors. What began as a routine late-night sweep ended with Prince William facing a sealed steel box, hidden beneath the altar of Queen Camilla's private chapel. A box that, once opened, revealed Princess Diana's missing letters and private journals. In this video, we'll retrace the night step by step, examine why William's reaction has struck such a deep chord, and consider why the chapel, of all places, became the focal point of a discovery that has reignited Diana's presence in the public imagination. The story begins with the quiet stillness of a late-night inspection. Guards tasked with ensuring the sanctity and safety of Camilla's chapel, a small but deeply personal space within the walls of Clarence's house, stumbled across something unusual. Beneath the altar, where candles and hymnals usually dominate, the men discovered a hidden compartment sealed by a steel box. The box was not casually placed, it was deliberately concealed, wedged tightly into the stone floor, and secured as though it had been meant to stay out of sight indefinitely. The discovery alone would have raised eyebrows, but the chapel setting made it all the more bizarre. For a place of reflection, prayer, and privacy, to hold a secret object of such weight suggested an intention far beyond chance. The moment word reached Prince William, the atmosphere shifted from quiet intrigue to urgent confrontation. He did not walk into the chapel calmly. He stormed in. Accounts from those present that night describe his expression as resolute, a man who already suspected what might be hidden away, and who refused to allow hesitation or palace politics to keep the truth buried. Despite resistance from aides, who cautioned patience and urged him to wait for King Charles's presence, William made his position clear. The box would be opened that night. No excuses, no delays. His determination framed the entire event, not just as a discovery, but as a moral test of loyalty, transparency, and respect for his mother's memory. When the heavy steel lid was finally pried open, the air inside the chapel shifted once more. Guards and aides leaned in, bracing themselves for jewels, documents, or perhaps something mundane. Instead, what lay inside stunned everyone. Folders of handwritten pages, bound journals, and sealed envelopes bore the unmistakable touch of Princess Diana. For years, whispers had suggested that Diana's private writings had either been destroyed or locked away in the deepest vaults of the monarchy. Yet here they were, concealed beneath an altar in Camilla's personal place of worship. The emotional weight of the discovery struck William first and hardest. These were not just artifacts, but his mother's own words, her voice preserved on paper, hidden from him for decades. It was the setting that made the revelation particularly damning. Had these journals been found in an archive, or tucked away in the library, the matter could have been framed as misplacement or clerical error. But inside Camilla's private chapel, the optics were devastating. For many, it suggested secrecy, even intent, a symbolic act of burying Diana's presence within Camilla's sacred space. In that moment, the story ceased being about dusty papers and became a narrative of rivalry, memory, and legacy. William, by tearing away the lid of the box, wasn't just opening a container. He was reopening old wounds that the monarchy had long hoped would remain closed. Word of the chapel discovery did not stay confined to the palace walls. Despite desperate attempts to contain the scene, whispers turned into headlines within days. The idea of Diana's writings being locked beneath Camilla's altar ignited a storm of public outrage. Candlelit vigils sprang up across the country, with supporters leaving flowers and notes marked with Diana's name. Around the world, the news struck an emotional chord. Diana was remembered not only as a royal figure, but as a woman whose voice had been silenced too soon. And now, in the most unexpected way, restored. That steel box, with its carefully preserved contents, became a symbol not just of secrecy exposed, but of truth breaking through layers of silence. For William, the discovery crystallised a role he had always been forced to play quietly, the protector of his mother's legacy. Unlike anyone else present that night, he carried the unique burden of personal connection. These were not abstract relics or historical curiosities, they were the written words of his mother, someone he had loved and lost in front of the entire world. By insisting the box be opened and refusing to bow to palace hesitation, William cemented his place as the moral voice of the family, someone willing to stand against secrecy even when it came at great personal and political cost. His actions positioned him as more than a future king. They cast him as the defender of his mother's memory, an image that resonated powerfully with the public. Camilla, on the other hand, faced a crisis of image unlike any she had weathered before. Even before details of the contents were revealed, the fact that the box had been hidden in her chapel invited damaging speculation. Was she attempting to suppress Diana's voice? Had she chosen the location deliberately to cloak her rival's memory in secrecy? Public opinion, already fractured, tilted heavily against her. The optics were disastrous. Camilla's most private sanctuary, had become the stage for one of the most explosive revelations in recent royal history. Her credibility, her reputation, even her role within the family, was cast into doubt. At the centre of the chaos stood King Charles, torn between his role as sovereign and as husband. His arrival at the chapel that night was described as urgent, almost frantic, as he called in senior security staff to take control of the scene. Yet his very attempt to contain the situation only deepened suspicions. To the outside world, it looked like damage control, a desperate bid to minimise fallout. To those inside the family, it underscored a dilemma Charles could not easily escape: defend his wife and risk being seen as suppressing Diana once again, or side with William and fracture the fragile balance of his household. The steel box has since taken on a life of its own as a symbol. It represents not just what was found inside, but the act of concealment itself, the attempt, whether deliberate or not, to lock away Diana's voice from the world. And yet, in being uncovered, it proves the opposite, that even decades later, Diana's presence cannot be silenced. Her words, her memory, her influence continue to break through stone walls and sealed boxes, shaking the monarchy at its foundations.
The discovery inside Camilla's private chapel did not stay a secret for long. In fact, it spread far faster than the palace ever anticipated, turning what might have been managed quietly into an uncontrollable storm. For a brief moment after the box was opened, there was a fragile silence in Clarence's house, as if those present were still processing the enormity of what they had seen. But that silence shattered almost instantly once aides realized the potential consequences. The writings of Princess Diana, hidden beneath Camilla's altar, were never going to be contained within palace walls. Before dawn, whispers circulated through the staff, and by morning, the first hints had already leaked into the press. The words of one insider summed it up best: it wasn't just a box being opened, it was a vault of ghosts unleashed. Outside, the story spread like fire through dry grass. Within hours of the first reports, news channels across the globe were carrying the story, headlines splashed with dramatic phrasing: Diana's voice found again, secret box beneath Camilla's chapel, William demands the truth. The imagery was irresistible, a son uncovering his mother's silenced voice from beneath the altar of the very woman who had become stepmother to him. It was a story of rivalry, secrecy, and vindication, and no amount of palace caution could soften the impact. By evening, people were already gathering outside royal residences, holding candles and signs bearing Diana's name. For them, it was as though Diana herself had reached out from the past to remind the world she had not been forgotten. William's role in the unfolding events became the centerpiece of public fascination. He was not just a passive witness to the discovery, he was the one who demanded the box be opened despite resistance. He had refused hesitation, refused the urging of aides to wait, and in doing so, he became a symbol of courage and integrity. The public latched onto that moment as proof of his devotion to his mother's legacy. For many, it elevated him above the shadows of palace politics, casting him as a figure willing to defend truth even when it came at personal cost. His decisiveness was contrasted sharply against Charles's hesitation and against Camilla's perceived secrecy. What made the discovery all the more explosive was the setting. A chapel is, by its very nature, a place of reverence, prayer, and sanctity. For the public, the idea that such a space had been used to conceal a steel box containing Diana's writings carried a powerful symbolism. It wasn't just about what was hidden, it was about where it was hidden. People interpreted it as a deliberate act, almost ritualistic, as though Diana's words had been entombed within Camilla's sanctuary to keep them suppressed. Whether or not this interpretation was true, the perception was enough to devastate Camilla's public standing. Almost overnight, her image crumbled. Years of carefully managed appearances, quiet public service, and attempts to soften public opinion seemed to evaporate. The optics of Diana's journals being found beneath her chapel altar undid it all. The media dredged up old rivalries and reminded audiences of past scandals, weaving them into the present narrative. Questions swirled not only about how the box ended up there, but also about why it had been hidden for so long. And in those questions, suspicion took root. King Charles faced a dilemma that was both personal and deeply public. To many, his decision to call in senior security staff on the night of the discovery seemed less like an effort to protect the family and more like an attempt to control the narrative. His attempts at containment backfired, painting him as someone prioritizing damage control over honesty. For the first time since his reign began, the king found himself caught in an impossible bind: stand by his wife and risk appearing complicit in secrecy, or acknowledge the public's outrage and risk fracturing his own household. Either choice left him weakened in the eyes of the people. Meanwhile, Diana's name once again dominated conversations across the globe. For younger generations who only knew her as a figure of history, the story brought her vividly back into focus. For those who had lived through her life and tragic loss, it was like reliving old wounds. Vigils, tributes, and public displays of remembrance sprang up spontaneously, not orchestrated by organizations but sparked by genuine public emotion. Diana's presence was once again alive in public consciousness, her writings becoming a symbol of truth rising through silence. Inside the palace, the atmosphere grew colder by the day. Trust fractured between family members, aides, and advisors. The question of how long the box had been hidden, who had placed it there, and who had known about it hovered over every conversation. William's anger remained sharp, not only at the concealment itself but at the resistance he faced when demanding answers. For him, this was not about protocol or optics. It was about betrayal, about being denied a part of his mother that had been deliberately locked away. Camilla, now at the center of the storm, found herself isolated. The chapel, once her place of peace and reflection, had become the site of her undoing. Every camera angle, every newspaper column, every social media post seemed to frame her as the antagonist in this story. Even those who had once sympathized with her struggled to defend the optics. The box beneath the altar became an image too powerful to counteract. In the eyes of the public, it was not just a mistake, it was a symbolic crime. The steel box itself, however, became something larger than a physical object. It was no longer just a container of papers, it became a metaphor for Diana's enduring presence and the truth that cannot be buried. Its existence proved that secrecy could not outlast the force of memory, that Diana's voice had found a way to speak again. And in that symbolism, the public found a rallying point. What began as a late-night discovery inside Clarence's house had turned into a movement of remembrance, sympathy, and outrage that spanned continents. At the heart of it all remained William, cast as the unwilling but resolute guardian of his mother's voice. His actions inside the chapel were replayed again and again in the press, amplified by eyewitness accounts and dramatized by media outlets. He had demanded the truth, and in doing so, he had placed himself firmly on the side of honesty and integrity. For the public, this wasn't just about royal drama. It was about a son defending his mother's legacy against secrecy, and that image would not easily fade. But this was only the beginning of the fallout. The discovery may have reignited Diana's presence, but it also plunged the monarchy into one of its most precarious moments. What came next? The long-term consequences for Camilla, the strained relationship between father and son, and the deeper meaning of Diana's words would prove even more explosive. In the days that followed the chapel revelation, one figure rose above the noise, the headlines, and the speculation: Prince William. The night he stormed into Camilla's private chapel and demanded the steel box be opened would come to be seen as a defining moment, not only in the context of this scandal but in the trajectory of his life. He was no longer just the heir to the throne. He became, in the eyes of the public, the unshakable defender of his mother's legacy. And this shift, subtle at first, began to fundamentally alter how people viewed the balance of power inside the monarchy. William's stance during the chapel incident was not accidental, nor was it born of impulse. Those close to him have long said that his mother's presence still guides him, not as a memory of the past but as a living compass for the future. When he heard about the steel box, the thought of hesitation was inconceivable to him. This was not palace property, not royal history to be catalogued, but a piece of his mother, her voice, her thoughts, her pain, and her hope, locked away without his knowledge. For William, to stand idly by would have been the greater betrayal. And so, when aides tried to stop him, when others urged patience, he made a choice that reverberated far beyond the walls of the chapel. He demanded answers, and he demanded them immediately. That demand struck a chord with millions. For years, William has been cast as a man of duty, balancing the weight of expectation with the desire for normalcy. But here, for the first time in a long time, the public saw not the polished figure of a future monarch, but the raw conviction of a son. It was this humanity, this refusal to let his mother's memory be sidelined yet again, that transformed the way people looked at him. The discovery inside Camilla's chapel wasn't just a family drama, it was a story of loyalty, integrity, and love. And in that story, William was the hero. Media outlets capitalized on this narrative immediately. Photographs of William leaving the chapel in the early hours of the morning were splashed across front pages. Commentators spoke of his unshakable resolve and his duty to Diana's memory. Editorials described him as the moral compass of the crown. For a public long accustomed to seeing palace scandals buried under silence, William's defiance stood out like a beacon. He had not chosen secrecy, he had chosen transparency, and that choice resonated across generations. This moment also deepened the contrast between William and Camilla in the public eye. While William was seen as the protector, Camilla became framed as the concealer. The optics of Diana's private writings being discovered beneath Camilla's altar created a natural divide in perception. On one side stood William, opening the box, revealing the truth. On the other stood Camilla, associated with the hiding of it. The starkness of that contrast only fueled the narrative of William as Diana's champion. Yet this wasn't just about optics. William's role carried deep personal weight for him. For years, he has carried the burden of his mother's memory in silence, balancing it against the expectations of his royal duties. But this discovery gave him something tangible, a physical representation of the voice he had lost. To stand over that box, to hold those journals in his hands, was not merely symbolic. It was a reunion, of sorts, with the mother he had been denied for so long. His demand to open the box was not just a statement of integrity, it was an act of love, a refusal to let his mother be erased or hidden away. Inside the palace, William's stance created ripples of unease. Some aides feared that his insistence on exposing the truth would set a precedent for future transparency, something the institution has always resisted. Others, however, quietly admired his determination. It was a reminder that not all within the palace walls were content with silence and secrecy. In this way, William's actions did more than honor Diana. They also challenged the culture of concealment that had defined the monarchy for generations. For the public, William's role became more than just personal. It became symbolic. He wasn't simply fighting for his mother's memory. He was standing for the principle that truth matters, even when inconvenient, even when painful. In a world where Diana's story has long been told through the voices of others, the discovery of her own words in her own handwriting carried extraordinary power. And William, by insisting they be brought to light, became the vessel through which her voice returned. The impact on his relationship with Charles was profound. Charles, torn between protecting his wife and addressing the fallout, found himself overshadowed by his son. Where Charles hesitated, William acted. Where Charles sought containment, William sought truth. This dynamic did not go unnoticed by the public, who increasingly began to view William as not only the future but also the present moral leader of the family. For many, it was a quiet but significant shift in perception. William was not waiting for his time, he was already stepping into it. The steel box, once a silent object buried beneath stone, became the symbol of this shift. It represented everything William stood for: honor, truth, and loyalty to his mother. And with every candle lit in Diana's memory, with every vigil held in her honor, William's role as her defender grew stronger. The more Camilla's credibility faltered, the more William's integrity soared. The discovery that could have fractured him instead fortified him, giving him a clarity of purpose that many believed had been long overdue. For William, this was not about politics or perception. It was about a son finally reclaiming his mother's voice from the silence imposed upon it. It was about demanding answers in a place where secrecy had reigned too long. And in doing so, he found himself standing not just as Diana's son, but as her protector, her living legacy within the walls of a monarchy still haunted by her absence. But while William's stance solidified his place as the people's defender, it also left Camilla facing an unraveling of trust unlike anything she had experienced before. The more William's star rose, the more Camilla's image fell. And soon, the question became not just about what Diana's writings contained, but about whether Camilla could ever recover from the devastating optics of this discovery. Camilla's world shifted overnight, and the weight of the chapel discovery bore down on her with an intensity she had not faced in decades. For years, she had worked tirelessly to craft a softer image, to step carefully into public life with gestures of service and dignity. Every engagement, every speech, Every carefully orchestrated appearance was designed to prove she belonged in the role she now held. But none of it could withstand the revelation that Diana's private writings had been discovered hidden beneath her private chapel's altar. The optics were catastrophic, undoing years of slow progress in a matter of hours. The symbolism of the setting was the most devastating factor. A chapel is supposed to be a sacred refuge, a place of prayer, and in Camilla's case, it was deeply personal. The discovery of the steel box there, no matter who placed it or how long it had been hidden, was interpreted in the harshest possible light. The public saw it as deliberate. To them, it looked like Diana's voice had been entombed beneath the very sanctuary where Camilla sought comfort. It was almost too perfect a metaphor, Camilla's space concealing the words of the woman who had defined so much of her past. The image required no explanation, no context. It spread across newspapers and television screens, reshaping public perception in an instant. For those who had never fully accepted Camilla, this was the confirmation they had been waiting for. Social media erupted with commentary, much of it merciless. Old wounds were reopened, with clips, photographs, and articles from decades past being resurfaced and reframed. Hashtags demanding accountability trended across platforms, painting her as the villain in a story where William had emerged as the hero. Even voices that had once spoken in her defense fell silent in the face of the overwhelming tide of criticism. Inside Clarence's house, Camilla reportedly grew increasingly isolated. The aides and advisors who had once carefully managed her image now found themselves unable to protect her. Every attempt at explanation was dismissed as spin. Silence only deepened suspicion. Even those closest to her acknowledged the optics were indefensible. She had not just lost control of the narrative, she had lost the ability to shape it at all. The story was no longer about her role as consort, it was about her association with secrecy, concealment, and betrayal. King Charles's position grew equally precarious. His arrival at the chapel on the night of the discovery, intended as a show of leadership and order, was interpreted by many as a desperate attempt at damage control. He had summoned senior security, tried to take possession of the box, and attempted to keep the incident behind palace walls. But by doing so, he inadvertently cast himself in the role of suppressor. Where William's actions were seen as bold and honest, Charles's were viewed as hesitant and protective of the very secrecy that had fueled outrage. The contrast between father and son could not have been sharper. For Charles, the dilemma was agonizing. On one side stood his wife, facing the greatest scandal of her life, her reputation crumbling under the weight of public anger. On the other stood his son, commanding admiration as the champion of truth and the defender of Diana's memory. To support Camilla meant standing against the public sentiment and further alienating William. To support William meant abandoning his wife in her hour of greatest need. Either choice fractured him as both a man and a monarch. The palace's attempts at control failed to ease the crisis. Statements crafted by communication staff, intended to emphasize unity and calm, only fueled speculation. Each word was dissected, each pause interpreted as hesitation. Silence, too, became its own form of statement, proof, in the eyes of many, that something was being hidden. With each passing day, the chapel discovery slipped further from the family's control and deeper into the public's imagination, taking on a life of its own. Meanwhile, Camilla's credibility seemed to erode beyond repair. Where she had once been viewed as a figure of quiet endurance, she was now cast as the antagonist in a battle she could not win. Her public appearances grew strained, her smiles forced, her presence met with uncomfortable silence rather than polite applause. The warmth she had worked so hard to cultivate vanished, replaced by cold stares and whispered doubts. Even neutral observers found it difficult to separate her from the imagery of the steel box beneath the altar. The scandal clung to her like a shadow that could not be shaken. The more her image faltered, the more William's grew. In the public eye, the contrast became a moral ledger. William, the son who had fought for truth; Camilla, the stepmother associated with secrecy. The imbalance was stark, and it only widened as vigils and tributes to Diana multiplied across the country. Each candle lit in her memory was another reminder of the gulf between Camilla's crumbling reputation and William's rising moral authority. What made the situation uniquely damaging was the sense of betrayal attached to it. This wasn't just about misplaced papers or forgotten relics. These were Diana's private words, her innermost thoughts, her voice. To have them concealed beneath Camilla's chapel was, for many, an act of profound disrespect, even if Camilla herself had not personally placed them there. The symbolism was enough to ignite outrage, and once that outrage took root, no explanation could undo it. Charles's own credibility suffered as well. His inability to manage the fallout, his visible torn loyalties, and his reliance on containment over transparency left him weakened. For the first time in his reign, the public openly questioned his judgment in ways that went beyond policy or ceremony. The scandal wasn't just damaging his wife, it was damaging him, and by extension, the monarchy itself. And yet, amidst the collapse of Camilla's image and the weakening of Charles's authority, Diana's presence only grew stronger. The writings themselves had not yet been released, but their very existence carried immense power. People believed they contained truths long buried, insights into her life and her pain that had been denied to the public. In this way, Camilla's downfall became Diana's revival. The more Camilla's credibility eroded, the more Diana's voice, even from beyond the grave, resonated. By the time the first week after the discovery ended, the monarchy stood on precarious ground. Camilla's reputation was in ruins. Charles's authority was diminished, and William's star was rising brighter than ever. The steel box had not only revealed hidden writings, it had reshaped the balance of power within the family itself. And as the public waited for Diana's words to be revealed, one truth became undeniable: the monarchy would never be the same again. The steel box in Camilla's private chapel was more than just a hidden container of papers. It became the turning point in a story that continues to haunt the monarchy. In the weeks that followed, the weight of its discovery reshaped everything: public perception, family dynamics, and the fragile balance of power within Clarence's house. At its heart, though, it was not just about scandal. It was about the enduring presence of Princess Diana, whose voice, silenced too soon, had returned to stir the conscience of the world once again. From the very first night, the box carried with it a symbolism too potent to ignore. It was no longer simply steel and stone. It was memory, truth, and legacy made tangible. The fact that it had been hidden beneath Camilla's chapel altar gave it a near-mythic resonance. It represented concealment, secrecy, and the attempt, whether deliberate or accidental, to suppress Diana's voice. Yet by being discovered, it transformed into the very opposite: a vessel of truth, a beacon that reminded the world that Diana's presence could never be erased. For a public that had loved her fiercely, this was vindication. For a monarchy that had long tried to move on, it was an unwelcome reminder that the past could not be buried. William's role in this story became the defining narrative of the scandal. He was not merely a witness, he was the one who demanded action, who refused hesitation, who pried open the box when others urged caution. That image, of a son reclaiming his mother's hidden voice, resonated across borders and generations. In William, people saw not just a prince, but a man honoring his mother with unshakable resolve. His decision to confront secrecy head-on marked him as the moral center of the family, and for many, the true embodiment of Diana's legacy. In demanding answers, William became more than heir to the throne. He became the custodian of truth. Camilla, on the other hand, faced a collapse of credibility from which she may never fully recover. Whether or not she was directly responsible for hiding the box ceased to matter. The optics were devastating. The fact that Diana's words had been entombed beneath her sacred space cast her, fairly or unfairly, as the antagonist of the story. Every candlelit vigil, every tribute to Diana, became a silent indictment of Camilla's role. Years of carefully managed public image dissolved in days, leaving her isolated, scrutinized, and distrusted. King Charles was left in the most unenviable position of all. His attempt to contain the situation backfired, making him appear complicit in secrecy rather than committed to truth. His torn loyalties, between protecting his wife and supporting his son, left him weakened, caught between forces he could not reconcile. The chapel discovery exposed not only Camilla's vulnerability but also his own fragility as monarch. The public began to question whether he could ever embody the strength and moral clarity the role required, especially when set against William's decisive stance. Yet perhaps the most profound impact of the chapel discovery was the way it revived Diana's presence on the world stage. Her writings, though not yet released, became the subject of endless speculation. What had she written? What truths lay within those pages? For many, the unanswered questions carried as much power as the contents themselves. It was as though Diana herself had reached from beyond the grave, reminding the monarchy and the world that her story was unfinished, that her voice still mattered. The steel box became a symbol of her enduring influence, proof that decades after her passing, she remained the figure most capable of shaking the foundations of the crown. The public response only amplified this reality. Vigils multiplied, drawing thousands who lit candles, laid flowers, and held signs bearing Diana's name. In cities across the globe, strangers gathered to remember her, to honor her, and to stand in solidarity with her son. The imagery was unmistakable. While the palace wrestled with secrecy and scandal, the people rallied behind Diana, their affection undimmed, their loyalty unshaken. The steel box was no longer just a royal discovery. It had become a public cause, a collective reminder of a woman who had touched hearts far beyond palace walls. Inside Clarence's house, however, the fallout continued to deepen. Relationships strained under the weight of suspicion. Whispers of who knew what, and for how long, poisoned the atmosphere. Trust fractured not only between William and Camilla but also between father and son. For William, the concealment of his mother's words was a wound too deep to ignore. For Charles, the need to preserve unity clashed painfully with the reality that unity had already crumbled. The box had not only revealed hidden writings, it had revealed hidden fractures in the family itself. And yet, amidst the turmoil, one truth emerged. The monarchy could no longer operate as though secrecy was strength. The public's demand for transparency, embodied in William's defiance, set a precedent that could not be ignored. The steel box had become the symbol of a new standard, one where silence and concealment were no longer tolerated, and where the truth, however uncomfortable, demanded to be heard. The lasting consequences of the chapel discovery are still unfolding. For Camilla, it marked the unraveling of an image carefully built over decades. For Charles, it revealed the limits of his authority and the fragility of his reign. For William, it was the moment he stepped fully into the role of moral leader, the defender of his mother, and the embodiment of integrity within the family. And for Diana, it was her return, her voice breaking through layers of secrecy, reminding the world that she remains as powerful in death as she was in life. In the end, the story of the chapel discovery is not simply about a hidden steel box. It is about memory, loyalty, and the truth that refuses to be silenced. It is about a son demanding answers, a wife facing the collapse of credibility, a king torn between duty and love, and a woman whose presence endures decades after her passing. The box beneath the altar may have been sealed in steel, but the moment it was opened, it shattered more than just bolts and locks. It shattered illusions, reawakened Diana's voice, and reminded the world that even the most carefully kept secrets cannot stay hidden forever. This is the lasting legacy of the night William stormed into Camilla's private chapel and demanded the truth. And as the steel box continues to cast its shadow, one thing is certain: Diana's voice, once silenced, will echo for generations to come.